Part 1 of The Ferret's Nest. Written by Love Glows in the Dark. Read by Bad Writer. Summary. Harry has a ferret and a whole lot of tattoos. Unfortunately, it's only one of these things Draco approves of. Potter! A pause. Potter, come out here right now! Harry finally shuffled out of the bedroom, toothbrush in his mouth, toothpaste on the corners of his lips, and one smear on his chin. His glasses were crooked up on his nose, and he was squinting against the bright yellow of the sunlight pouring into the living room. His hair was absolutely beyond help. He was also shirtless, clad in only joggers, and his hip bones distracted Draco long enough for Harry to pull his toothbrush out of his mouth to ask thickly through a mouthful of foam, "What?" Draco stood under the archway of the kitchen entrance, arms akimbo, and his face pink with anger. "Look at this," he hissed, pointing at something in the direction of the table inside the kitchen. Harry ambled over, and Draco, despite his fury, reluctantly and furtively admired the way his muscles moved, his various tattoos seeming to dance over his skin. But when Harry entered the kitchen and snorted in amusement, emitting a spray of foam, Draco gnashed his teeth and kicked him in the shin. "He did this!" Draco yelled, gesturing wildly at the scene in front of him. "He fucking did this!" Atop the table, a 2-litre bottle of pumpkin juice lay on its side. Its contents spread across the round expanse of the teak, dripping off the edges at the various points. The Daily Prophet, opened at page 6, was plastered onto the table, completely soiled in juice. A steady trickle of juice dripped onto Draco's chair. Harry's chair, however, was clean. On the floor, casually lapping at the largest puddle, was a long, extremely fluffy, snow-white ferret, its pink ears and nose wiggling every few seconds. "Stop encouraging this behaviour!" Draco shouted, pointing as though the scene wasn't self-explanatory. Harry turned to him, hands held up in a helpless gesture, his mouth pursed around his toothbrush, quivering with a grin he was holding back. "I didn't encourage," he garbled, shaking his head, tangled locks of hair jumping. "You never do anything when he behaves badly," Draco said, heatedly, despite the fact he was beginning to feel stupid already. Because the next second, Harry waved his hand in a broad circle over the mess and wondrously cleaned it up. The newspaper still looked a bit damp, but the furniture was spotless, and the cream kitchen tiles sparkled. Immediately, though, the ferret set up a round of extremely indignant chattering, falling onto its back and rolling over once before scuttering off to its cage in a temper, his little paws slipping on the smooth floor. "Fucking ferret," Draco muttered, elbowing Harry's side and reaching for the empty bottle of juice. "I'll kill it one day," he added sotto voce, as Harry calmly resumed brushing his teeth, green eyes twinkling with mirth, irritating Draco even more. And then Harry reached out and grabbed Draco's bum, filling his hand with one round cheek and squeezing it. Yelping in startlement, Draco turned around and raised a hand to slap his arm, but Harry had already slipped away, chortling through a mouthful of toothpaste, the lines of tattoo across the muscle of his broad back glowing golden in the sunlight. Draco had seen that tattoo 7 years ago for the very first time, and since then had never failed to find it, and every other tattoo on Harry's body, rather exceptionally beautiful every single time he stared at it for more than a few seconds. The Busy Bee in Diagon had been the most popular haunt of nearly every recent Hogwarts alumni. Draco had found himself there with Pansy, Goyle, and Blaze almost every Friday, and sometimes even Saturday evening. It felt oddly like home. The stained glass and wooden interiors with dim, golden lighting, the buzz of bright chatter, and swift service reminding him of the Great Hall. Nearly every table had boasted a familiar face, although That also meant he had to put up with a great deal of hostile glares. But like everything else after the war, those had eventually faded away too. Speaking of the war, its three most lauded heroes were often present there too, of course. Draco exchanged frequent glances with Weasley, Granger and Potter. Most of all Potter. He was in aura training, and sometimes wore his trainee robes. Cream, with 2 scarlet stripes down the side. Occasionally he'd take them off to reveal his ludicrous ripped jeans and weird muggle band t-shirt underneath. He looked ridiculous like that. Utterly ridiculous. When had he even grown so tall? And was he getting bigger because of the exercise? Or was he just getting fat? Probably getting fat, yes. Why didn't he ever get a haircut? One time, he'd come in looking like he had, in fact, had a haircut, but the very next day, he'd gone and had a mane of tangles again. And Draco had nearly flung his tumbler at him across the pub. And why did he always return Draco's stares? Draco was staring at him because, well, he had reasons. But what was Potter's excuse? It wasn't even angry glaring. He stared. And Draco sometimes had to go to the loo and check if he had dry ketchup on his chin from when he'd been eating the chips that Goyle ordered, that Draco had insisted he did not want. One day he got his answer. Malfoy! Someone boomed from across the pub, and Draco nearly went into cardiac arrest. When he looked up, he found Weasley waving at him like a windmill to beckon him over. What the fuck? Muttered Blaze next to him. Ignore him, Draco, Pansy hissed from across the table. I want more beer, grunted Goyle from next to Pansy. Draco, however, was staring curiously, not at Weasley, but at Potter, who was sitting there with his face a shade darker than Weasley's hair, looking as though he'd like very much to simply expire. From what Draco could make out as he watched Potter pluck weakly at Weasley's t-shirt and murmur something plaintively, Weasley determinatively ignoring him and elbowing his hand off, Potter was trying to plead with Weasley about something he seemed to have no control over. Meanwhile, Granger looked like she was trying very hard not to laugh, and kept her gaze carefully averted, stirring her drink with a long wooden stick with a cherry stuck on it. Intrigued beyond rational thought, Draco slipped out of their booth and made his way over to where the trio sat at the bar. Potter was determinedly not looking at him, and for some reason this made Draco's gut clench with a mixture of defiant anger and forlorn disappointment. Granger flashed him a swift smile and produced a book, seemingly out of thin air, that she buried her face into with an air of overt interest. Weasley, on the other hand, simply beamed at Draco, holding his big, ruddy hand out. Draco looked down at it. He had very fine red hair on his arms, and some sort of marks that looked like, at some point, had thick ropes wound around them, tight enough to leave permanent scars. There was sprinkling of freckles across the back of his hand and fingers, and his nails were surprisingly clean and neatly trimmed. With a smile that probably made him appear nauseated, Draco carefully placed his long white hand in Weasley's and shook it weakly. "Weasley?" he said stiffly. "Malfoy!" he almost shouted. And when Draco winced, he looked a bit flustered. His blue eyes flitted sideways in a vague, nervous manner. "Harry!" he abruptly screamed and thumped Potter on the back hard enough to knock him forward. Potter, scarlet-faced and furiously gulping at his beer, choked and sprayed beer all over the gleaming bar before hacking violently, slapping himself on the chest repeatedly. Draco had the overwhelming urge to laugh until he pissed himself, but he did refrain, biting his lip and casually looking up at the ceiling. "Look, it's Malfoy," Weasley said loudly, ignoring the fact that Potter now had tears streaming down his face. Granger, lips pursed, handed Potter a napkin, and Potter mopped his face feverishly, turning slightly to offer Draco a watery smile. "Hi, Mouth." He suddenly relapsed into coughing, and Draco stood there, seriously considering putting Potter out of his misery and just rejoining his friends. "So what have you been up to, eh?" Weasley inquired, shooting a look at Harry that clearly displayed disappointment. "I work at my brother's shop," he went on before Draco could even open his mouth to reply. "You know, Weasley Wizard Wheezes. It's pretty cool. But you know what's cooler?" he said, leaning forward, eyes very, very wide. "Auras. They're cool, you know, like preventing crimes and stuff. I mean, you'd know," he added with a chuckle, waving a hand at Draco's left arm. Draco went very still, feeling like he'd been slapped. Weasley had gone purple in the face. Potter had his face in his hands, and Granger looked utterly aghast. "Is there a reason you yelled me over here, Weasley?" Draco asked coldly. "Sorry," mumbled Weasley. "I didn't mean to say that. I only meant Harry's going to be an aura, you know?" he said, chest puffing out with pride as he elbowed Potter repeatedly. Harry, show him your ministry tag. Harry, come on! Harry, show him your..." "He doesn't want to see," Potter started to mumble, but Weasley seized him by the shoulder and spun him around on his stool, nearly sending Potter sliding off his seat. Draco just had a moment to spot something silver hanging from a long, thin chain around his neck, gleaming against the dark material on Potter's black t-shirt, before Weasley was waving the round badge, the size of a sickle, in Draco's face. Blinking in bemusement, Draco leaned over and blinked at the badge that had printed across it, "Potter, Trainee 75647. "Yeah?" Weasley panted. "Cool, yeah?" "Sure," Draco drawled. "May I go back now?" he asked sarcastically, half turning away. "Tattoo!" Weasley bellowed. Potter loudly smacked himself on the forehead. "What?" Draco snapped, wondering if it was another jab at his dark mark. "Harry's got a tattoo," Weasley explained, slightly out of breath. "He's got a really big tattoo. It's on his back. Want to see? It's on his..." "Harry, mate, take off your..." "Ron!" Granger cut in finally as Potter looked at Weasley with his mouth open, looking horrified. "Harry does not want to undress in public." Draco suddenly realized that he was having more fun than he had in years. Crossing his arms, he stood there and grinned. "But he needs to show Malfoy his tat," Weasley started. "He's not going to show anyone anything in public," Granger stated firmly. "Malfoy," she added, and suddenly Draco wasn't grinning anymore. "Would you like to join Harry for a drink? Ron and I were just leaving." Draco felt his face heat, and for the first time felt a bit bad for Potter, who now looked like he was either going to throw up or bolt out of the pub. Draco said, voice quavering. I mean... He turned to see Blaise, Pansy and Goyle staring avidly over at them, looking as though they wanted to start flinging hexes. Draco shook his head minutely at them and then turned back around. "Fine," he said, ensuring that he had his nose very high in the air. "I suppose I could grace Potter with my presence for a drink. Why not?" Weasley now looked more triumphant than he had when the Dark Lord's body hit the ground lifelessly, after Potter had finished him off. Granger didn't look fooled for a second by Draco's lofty speech. Rolling her eyes, she got to her feet and collected her coat and handbag. Weasley simply stood there, looking very pleased with himself. "Ron," called Granger pointedly. "What?" He looked around. "Oh, yes. And then to Potter, in a loud whisper, "The tattoo!" Potter now just stared straight ahead, cheeks and ears flaming red, hand clenched into fists in his lap. Draco slid onto the stool next to him and placed neatly clasped hands on the bar, looking around the pub with great interest, as though he'd never seen human beings before. Minutes passed, and Potter still hadn't spoke, Draco was sitting close enough to him that he could smell Potter's cheap muggle deodorant, a smell that he most certainly did not find oddly erotic. When he stole a glance at him, he saw a single drop of sweat trickle down the side of Potter's face. Draco could feel himself starting to sweat beneath his arms and resisted the urge to sniff his armpits. The crowd around them went on chattering and drinking, completely unaware of the enormity of the situation Draco was in. Finally, Draco grew nervous enough that it translated into impatience. "Whiskey," he snapped at Potter, who jumped in his seat and turned to look at him guiltily. He replied eloquently. "I'll take a neat whiskey, if you don't fucking mind," Draco spat, wondering why he was getting more and more irritated by the second. Maybe it was just a natural reaction to him being around Harry Potter. Potter scowled. "Do I resemble the fucking barkeep?" he asked, pushing his stupid glasses up his nose. "Fine, I'll just go then," Draco said, abruptly giving up and turning on his stool to hop off and stomp away. Potter's arm shot out, sturdy fingers curling around Draco's wrist. His grip unexpectedly strong. He sighed. "Sorry," he said with a hint of a scowl still lingering on his face. And then, before Draco could reply, he called out to the barkeep, who'd appeared on the other side of the circular bar. "Hey Martin, can I have a neat whiskey, please? And another one of these." He indicated to his empty pint. And that had been Draco's first date with Harry. It involved mostly a lot of strained politeness, lingering glances and curious questions. There had also been plates of crisps, fresh fish and chips, and casual touches and firmer eye contact. It was past 11 when they finally decided it was time to head on home. Potter had insisted on paying and had said with a shrug, "You can pay next time." And it was after the next time that Draco, being pressed up against the wall of an alley behind the restaurant they dined in, had asked, between furious, wet kisses, to see Potter's tattoo. Potter had grinned and pulled his neatly tucked shirt out of his crisp trousers, pulling it off over his head and turning to show Draco the bold lines of the outline that stretched across Potter's back. The stag head, situated between his sharp shoulder blades, was tilted back proudly, and his antlers stretched all the way up his shoulder. On the stag's head was a wreath of lilies. There was no colour or anything flashy about it whatsoever. But Draco was left breathless as he ran his fingertips over the lines of the tattoo. And Potter had pulled his shirt back on, leaving it untucked and pressing Draco into the brick wall to kiss him some more. He'd whispered against Draco's mouth, "So what do you think?" Draco had considered lying, but all he could do was whisper back the truth. "I love it."